Life is hard. Church shouldn't be. Life is hard, right? You know, things happen. Even the people in your life, and you look at them, you're like, everything is all together. Their life looks so easy. Even those people, maybe compared to your life or the lives of others, it is relatively easy. But even those people, life can be really hard. Everybody has stuff happening. Life is hard. But church, it shouldn't be. But oftentimes church can be really hard. And this is a phrase coined by one of our leaders here at the church, Angie McElroy. She was Angie Burns back then when she said it. And we were reflecting on where the church was, because the church was stuck when I first started doing ministry here. And there was a lot of things about church that was hard. And Angie just one day was like, life is hard. Church shouldn't be. Church should be a place that helps us deal with the difficulties of life in practical and profound ways. Now, there's a lot of things that make church pretty hard. I just want to share a few of those with you. And these things especially make church hard for those that haven't been to church in a long time, those that are new to church. One of the things that makes church hard is what I would call code language. Things like the narthex, the benediction, the sacristy. I was just talking with somebody this past week that didn't grow up in a liturgical style church, and she had no clue what these things were. And I was like, yeah, you know, like if you didn't grow up around this makes church hard. But you know what? The narthex, it's the lobby. If we want to make church easy, if we want to be able to meet people where they are, why don't we just call it the lobby? Why don't we call the sacristy, which is just that little storage room next to the sanctuary, the little storage room? It's that easy, you know? Life is hard. Church shouldn't be. And when we get caught up in our own churchy code language, sometimes that becomes a barrier or a stumbling block for people. Another thing that makes church hard is unwritten rules. From time to time, I meet people that come to our food pantry, and I invite them to church, and they're interested in coming. And one of the questions that comes up often from our guests at the food pantry is, what do I need to wear? Because they're struggling to be able to make ends meet, and they likely don't have very nice clothes, and they're worried that they have to dress up nicer than they're able to do so. And I say, you know, our dress code is simply this: dress. Right? Not like wear a dress, but like don't come naked. Outside of that, pretty much anything is okay. And if you show up in your pajamas, I'm glad you're here. And if somebody judges you, and somebody probably will, that's their problem, not your problem, okay? Jesus says don't judge. And in terms of unwritten rules, you know, churches can have all sorts of these, and it creates a toxic environment. That's why here at Faith, we work really hard to have all of our rules written down so we know what's guiding us and not have a bunch of unwritten rules. A third thing that I think makes church kind of hard, especially for new people, are strange expectations, like public singing. You know, outside of your car, in the shower, where do you sing with other people? Yet Matthew gets up here, has the audacity to be like, stand on up and come sing with us, you know? Like, that's crazy if you didn't grow up in church. Like, that's really weird. Or, you know, like giving, you know? The pandemic, it ruined a lot of lives, and it cost us a ton. But there were some good things that came out of the pandemic. One of them was we stopped passing the plates here in our church, and many of us had wanted to stop that practice for some time. We just didn't really have the guts to do so. We were afraid that people wouldn't give if we didn't pressure them into it, you know? But when the pandemic happened, we were able to stop that practice and just give an invitation to generosity. And, you know, if you want to give here, you give on the Church Center app. There's instructions in your bulletin, or there's like a church lady on the wall, and there's a box underneath that. And now we have some fun with it. But giving can be really weird, you know, and you show up to church, and if you grew up in church, you understand that expectation. But, you know, these are things that make church kind of hard, and life is hard. But church shouldn't be. And there's other things that can make church really hard. You know, churches tend to fight over surface concerns, you know. Like, churches split over the style of music alone. There's been many churches that have done that. Churches get all bent out of shape about programs, and we always have to do things because we've always done it this way. I've even heard of church fights over the color of the carpet in the sanctuary. Churches can become really hard, and they get caught up in these surface concerns. And if a church is caught up in those surface concerns, I tell you that beneath the surface is a compromised foundation. That something's really wrong in the way that they are seeing their practice as Christians. And this idea of a compromised foundation is really, in a sense, what we're talking about in this sermon series that is going into week number 8, called The Most Important Story You've Never Been Told. And if you're new here today or you haven't been here in a while, what you need to know is the most important story you've never been told. It's the story of the Bible because, we're a church and I'm a pastor, so we talk about the Bible here every Sunday. But the part of the story that you might not have ever been told is this part. The fact that the Bible is a sequential story of 4 covenants that lead to a 5th and final covenant. You can go back into the Old Testament and you can find wisdom by just looking at a text, but if you really want to understand what's going on and you want to make sure that you're on the same page as Jesus and the New Testament writers, you need to understand it's a sequential story of 4 covenants. These are partnerships formed with various individuals and groups of people based on promises made between those people and God. And those 4 covenants, the covenant with Noah, Abraham, Israel, and David, lead to a 5th and final covenant that Jesus announces when he shares a Passover meal at his Last Supper with his disciples, a practice we remember every month when we take communion together. It's the new covenant. And when Jesus came, everything changed. Everything changed. There was a huge changing point in what was going on because he announces a new covenant. And it's the failure to embrace this change, the significance of Jesus and how it changed the way we should think, the way we should act, the way we relate to God, the way the partnership works. It's the failure to embrace this change that has caused the decline and failure of the church. Because look, we talked about this in the first couple weeks. In the first century, the way of Jesus was downright irresistible. If you read the gospel accounts, if you read the story of the early church written by Luke in the book of Acts, wherever the gospel was proclaimed, crowds of people showed up, and it struck them at the heart, and it changed them, and it changed the world around them. And back in June, we talked about the history of the church, and we learned that despite just incredible odds against the church, persecution, and all sorts of troubles, the church grew exponentially. In the first century and the centuries that followed, the church and the way of Jesus was almost irresistible. But somehow, for some reason, in the 21st century, it's become very resistible. And you know people, maybe you are people, that have had a church experience where you walked away, where you didn't want to be part of that. And this series has been all about trying to figure out what happened. And you should know that we're studying a book that talks about this issue. On Thursday nights, there's a group of us that are coming together, and it's a book by Andy Stanley called Irresistible, and I've been showing this quote throughout the series. Andy says, "I'm convinced that it's the mixing, blending, and integration of the old covenant, the old way of thinking, the old approach, with the new covenant that Jesus announces that makes the modern church so resistible." There's an improper mixing and blending of Old Testament, Old Covenant ways of thinking and approaching the world, thinking about yourself and the world around you. They've gotten mixed in to the brand new covenant, the thing that Jesus announced that changed everything. And that mixing, blending, has somehow caused the church to lose its way. Let's talk about 3 examples of the old mixed into the new. The first one is this idea that the knowledge of God is reserved for sacred people. That there's special people, that my pastor, my priest, my spiritual leader is the only one that has the knowledge of God, and you got to hear him. It's generally a him in these contexts. You got to hear this special person who's got this sacred knowledge that's only that individual. And that idea is an old covenant, Old Testament idea that's got mixed into the new. God announces the coming of the new covenant through the prophet Jeremiah 600 years before Jesus has his ministry. And God says through the prophet Jeremiah, he says, "They will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest." Everyone will have access to the knowledge of God. I'm up here preaching, but I don't have special access to the knowledge of God. And you're like, then why should we show up on a Sunday, Here's why. Because of the generosity of some of the people in this congregation, I'm paid to be able to spend a good majority of my time every week studying the scripture to prepare a message for you. And so I take that very seriously, and I hope it's helpful. But I don't have special line to God any more so than any of you do. The new covenant is available to everyone. But that idea has been mixed and blended in. The second idea is that God's presence is reserved only for sacred spaces. That you got to come to this place, to this church, this temple, to feel God's presence. But again, through the prophet Jeremiah, God said 600 years before Jesus, referring to the new covenant, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. This sanctuary is a sacred space. You know why? Because you all are here. Because hope is proclaimed here. Because the love of Christ is here. But when you all are not here, it's just a building. What makes it sacred is the people, the church gathered. But this idea that comes from the Old Testament that you got to go somewhere to connect with God. You can connect with God on the golf course. Please don't start golfing on Sunday mornings instead of coming here. You can connect with God. God is everywhere. God is available. God's law, God's way is in our minds and written on our hearts. The third way that the old is mixed into the new is God's acceptance is reserved for a sacred set of rules. That you got to follow the Big Ten. You got to follow the essential five, whatever it is, but there's a sacred set of rules, and you got to follow those in order to be accepted by God. But again, through the prophet Jeremiah, God said 600 years before Jesus when announcing the new covenant, for I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. As we've talked about week after week, the new covenant is a unilateral set of promises by God for all people, based on God's grace, undeserved, unearned favor for you. It is something entirely new and different, and it is a game changer. And yet, we have a sacred people and sacred places with sacred rules approach that's mixed and blended into our new covenant churches, and it makes church difficult and confusing. But I need to tell you today, and this is good news, if you've ever found church to be a bit confusing, to be a bit difficult, to make life harder, not easier. The church in the beginning and throughout was always meant to be simple. And so I want to take you to a story where this was established by the early church. The year is 48 AD, maybe 49, 47. We don't really know, but that's an estimate based on what scholars think of what happened. But around the year 48 AD, after Jesus has died on the cross and been resurrected, and the church has begun to grow and establish itself, Luke, the writer of the book of Acts, tells us this story. It says, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch, where and were teaching the believers. Now, Antioch is north of Judea. And when you think of going north, you don't say go down, do you? What do you say? Go up, right? Right? If you're going to go from Indianapolis to Chicago, you're like going up to Chicago, right? You know, if you're going to Nashville, you're going down to Nashville, all right? The reason they say they went up to Antioch, or they came down from Judea to Antioch, is because Judea and Jerusalem is up on a mountain. Just some geographical information for you there, right? They come down and they start teaching the believers, unless you're circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. This is Old Covenant, Old Testament law. But remember, these are people in the church, and the church is established by the new covenant that Jesus announces. And so they're wanting to mix and blend a little Old Covenant law into the gospel of God's grace that is the new covenant. And this brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. Because Paul understands that a little bit of yeast rises the whole dough. This is his metaphor he uses to say a little bit of Old Covenant thinking, a little bit of rule keeping, earning your way in, mixed into the gospel of God's grace, changes the gospel of God's grace into something other than what Jesus came to announce. You're going to mess it up if you do that. And so Paul, he's got no chill. He's completely upset by this. So Paul and Barnabas were appointed, along with some of the other believers, to go up to Jerusalem, because it's a mountain, even though they're traveling south, to see the apostles and the elders about this question. The apostle and the elders, also known as the OGs. You know what OGs means, right? What does it mean? Original gangsters? No, man. original Galileans. Come on. Right, like Peter, James, and John. In fact, Peter, he's up first, and Peter, he's already begun to understand that the gospel of grace, you can't contain it, you can't put it in a box, so that it's going to expand to the entire world as Jesus said it would. And he's had these experiences, so he's talking about how he's seen people outside of the people of Israel, outside of the covenant made with ancient Israel, respond to the gospel of grace. And then he comes and he kind of gives like the finishing statement. And this is so good. Peter, it's incredible. He says to those that want to mix and blend some old covenant into the new, he says, now then, why do you try to test God? You see, you think you're testing these people, these Gentiles, but who you're really trying to test here is God, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to test God. Why are you trying to test God by putting on the necks of the Gentiles a yoke that is a teaching, a way of thinking, a standard, a yoke that neither we, us Jewish people, have been under the old covenant for entire, all the generations that come before us, that neither we nor our ancestors read the Old Testament sometime. They never keep the covenant. That's the story of the Old Testament, if you don't know. It's just over and over again the people of Israel failing to keep the covenant, and God, despite that failure, God showing up again and giving them opportunity after opportunity. Neither we, the current day Jewish people, nor our ancestors have ever been able to bear. We've never been able to keep that set of standards, that set of rules. Why are you trying to put that on anybody else when we know that nobody can keep it? No. We believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus, i.e. the new covenant, that we are saved, just as they are. There's one way. It's through grace. It's through the goodness of God. It's not the goodness of God plus some other things. And why would you do that to anybody? You think you're testing them to see if they're faithful? You're trying to test God. God has announced through Jesus Christ that you're saved by grace. And then James, the brother of Jesus, stands up. He's got kind of the final word. And he says, "It is my judgment." When I think of James, some of you remember James Honey that was here. He was our worship leader for a little bit. And he was like this big, tall guy with a beard, and like boots, and made me feel small when he was up here, okay? He was a big guy. And, for some reason I think of James, like this big guy, like this is James. It is my judgment. Like everybody's listening, this is this big figure. It is my judgment. Therefore, here's what I want you to know. It is my judgment. Therefore, we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Life is hard. Church shouldn't be. Don't make this difficult for new people, people that don't know the gospel, unchurched, don't have code language, don't have unwritten rules, weird expectations. Don't make it hard for people to come to the life-saving message of hope and love and inclusion that is the gospel of God's grace. Don't make it difficult. Jesus' brother, Big James, this is my judgment. Instead, he says, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. To which you're thinking, did James just smuggle 4 old covenant laws into the new covenant? Hold on a second. It was so clear and so simple. Then he has to go ahead and smuggle these 4 in. What is he doing? Now, Luke, he's a brilliant writer. And so he addresses this issue with what James says next. He says, we should write them and tell them to abstain from these things. Why? For the law of Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogue on every Sabbath. In other words, when you go out and start spreading the good news of God's grace, of God's inclusive love for everyone, you need to understand that in some of these places there's well-established Jewish communities that have been practicing the old covenant for a long time. And they have sensitivities. And God's love is for them as well. And so, when you go out there, I want you to keep it simple, but don't be offensive. Don't be offensive. Yes, You're under the freedom of Christ. And all those rules and regulations that used to contain you and confound you, you no longer are obligated to follow those. You got one guiding principle, and we're going to get to that at the end of this. One guiding principle. Yet, not everybody is where you are. And so as you go out with the freedom of Christ guiding you, with this message of God's grace, just don't be offensive to other people. No, be gentle with them. The Apostle Paul, he echoes this idea years later in his letter to the Romans. He says, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister. Don't carry your gospel of grace in such a way that it creates a stumbling block for other people, that it's offensive. Now, kind of changing the direction here for a moment. Isn't it cool that Jesus reduces 613 rules down to one? Did you know that? Isn't that cool? How many of you rather try to obey 613 rules rather than one? Nobody? Jesus, he keeps it simple. He simplifies it all. In fact, here's the first time that he breaks it down to one. It's going to kind of go through some various iterations, but the first time is in the Sermon on the Mount. Hold up your hand, 5 fingers on your hand. Matthew chapter 5, that's where you find the greatest sermon ever preached, Sermon on the Mount. You should read that tonight. Sermon on the Mount, towards the end, Jesus says, so in everything, do to others, how many of you heard this before? Do to others, it was Jesus who said it, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets. All that red on there, that's the law, and the blue is the prophets. Although some scholars think that law and the prophets was Jesus' shorthand for saying the entire tradition. All of what came before us, the entire tradition, is summed up with do to others what you would have them do to you. The golden rule. Jesus takes 613 laws, this complex tradition, and reduces it down to one thing that you can remember and take home. Many weeks later, maybe years later, towards the end of his ministry, Jesus, he's confronted by an expert of the law. And we're told that one of them, an expert of the law, he tested him with this question. He wasn't seeking knowledge, he was trying to trap Jesus. He says, teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law, in the Old Covenant? In the 613, what is the greatest one? And Jesus, he gives the obvious answer, quoting from Deuteronomy, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. That's what everybody was expecting him to say. The test has been passed, except Jesus is not done. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the second is like it. Second, there is no second. I asked for the greatest commandment. Jesus is like, I'm not finished. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. This relationship. And the second is like it, meaning it's bound together with it. If you had a coin, it's two sides of the same coin. Second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And in recorded history, to the best of my understanding, nobody up until that point had ever combined those two Old Testament laws together. It was unexpected and unprecedented. And Jesus says, all the law and the prophets hang on these. The entire tradition, everything we've been taught hangs on love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And in Luke's version, the teacher of the law, he says, well, who's my neighbor? You know, he's going to try to trap Jesus. And Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you haven't read the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's Luke chapter 10, okay? Go home and read it. You're welcome. It is one of the best stories in history. It's so powerful. But I'm just going to bring us back to something we looked at last week. When asked the question, who is my neighbor? If loving God and loving neighbor, if everything hangs on that, who's my neighbor? We can just go back to something Jesus said last week in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends his rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you weren't here last week, we talked about how what Jesus teaches is better than rules, and that the New Testament, or the new covenant standard is not a set of rules. It is the character of God. We are to be like God. Page 1 theology, you were created in the image of God, and we are to live out God's character. And this is how Jesus describes God's character. He gives his blessing to the evil and the good. Gives his blessing, his grace to the righteous and the unrighteous. Who is your neighbor? It is the good and the not so good. It is everyone. But then there's the question, what does love look like? Because, I love pizza, and I love the Chicago Bears, even though they hurt my feelings so much. Although we won, got our first victory on Thursday, but that's another topic. What does love look like? And Jesus, in his last opportunity to teach, as recorded in the Gospel of John, chapter 13, he says to them this. He says, "A new command I give you." This is not number 614. A new command as in one to replace all the rest. This one thing, the 613 down to one. I just want you can remember one thing. This is what I want you to remember. A new command I give you. Love one another. Like I love pizza? No, not exactly. Love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. And the advantage that the people in the room had is that they'd spent the last 3 years experiencing the love of Jesus. They'd spent the last 3 years watching how Jesus met people where they were, how Jesus touched the untouchables, how he gave grace to people that didn't deserve it. They were there when he healed the servant of a centurion, a Roman officer, part of the occupying nation that was subjecting the Jewish people to judgment. They were there when Jesus, he didn't get offended when Peter over and over again messed up. He gave time after time, met people where they were, sometimes challenged them. They had experienced the fact that most of them had long been passed over by all the rabbis, and they thought they were resigned to a life of limited opportunity. Yet Jesus saw potential in them that they didn't even see in themselves. He says, as I've loved you, as I saw the goodness in you, as I saw God's favor for you, I want you to love other people that way. As I've given you grace, I want you to give other people grace. By this, everyone will know that you're my disciples if you love one another. I want you to love like I loved. Because the new covenant standard is not a set of rules. The new covenant standard is God's character, and we learn about God's character in the clearest picture through the life and teaching and ministry of Jesus. By this, if you want to be a disciple of Jesus, the one thing that will identify is not where you go to church, it's not that you have the best pastor or priest or what have you, it's not that you know all the sacred rules, it's just one thing. It's really simple. Love like I loved. Now, you might be thinking, simple as that is, that's pretty daunting. You're telling me that I have to love like Jesus loved? Like the greatest human to ever live? That's the standard? There's good news. Jesus goes on in chapter 14. He says, look, if you love me, keep my commands, and the command is this one, love like I loved. If you love me, keep my commands, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another advocate to help you and be with you forever. The advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom my Father will send in my name. And he will teach you all things and remind you of everything I have said to you. In other words, you're not alone, and you don't have to do it on your own. This is the part of my message that is not teaching but preaching. This is the part of my message that isn't talking about what you need to do, which is learn the teachings of Jesus. If you want to be a disciple of Jesus, learn to love like Jesus. This is the part of the message that talks about what God is going to do for you. Because God wants to send his Spirit for you. And you don't have to do it on your own. Much of life is about doing it all on your own. But the good news is that there's the Spirit of God. There's a power that is greater than your own individual power. And Jesus is saying, if you try to love like I love, I'm going to send my Spirit. It's going to help guide you. It's going to empower you. God's power is available in your life to do the work of love. And if you've ever tried to give blessing to someone that didn't deserve it, you know you need a power that is greater than your own will and ability. And that's the standard. That's what we're about. And we're not alone in it. Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Don't be afraid. It's really simple. We as the church are to be really simple, to not make it difficult for people to come to the gospel, to not add rules and requirements that are unnecessary. Let's just call it the lobby. Everybody knows what that is. Let's keep it as simple as possible and keep ourselves focused on the one thing that defines us as disciples, loving like Jesus, extending unearned, undeserved favor to the righteous and the unrighteous alike. And we're not troubled and we're not afraid because we know we don't have to do it on our own. So, a really practical, simple application for you to begin applying in your life today. Whatever situation it might be, ask the question, how can I love like Jesus? How can I love like Jesus? What does it look like to love like Jesus in this situation? Whether it's at work, whether it's at home, whether it's with somebody else, whether it's with yourself. Sometimes the person that most needs your love is you. How can I love like Jesus? How can I extend unearned, undeserved favor, grace to those around me? Let us pray.